Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Keisha Ledlow. I'm the Texas System of Care Project Director with the Health and Human Services Commission, and I'm very pleased to be your host for this conference session. Today, we begin day 2 of our 2020 Southwest First Episode Psychosis Conference with our opening session entitled Future Directions for Coordinated Specialty Care. I want to thank our wonderful speaker for being here with us today, and I really want to thank all of you for joining us. We truly hope you find today's presentation engaging and helpful in your work. As a disclaimer, this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this presentation are the views of our speaker and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next slide. All right, let's get started. So we have an amazing presenter to start off our morning. Dr. Nev Jones is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Morsani College of Medicine, University of South Florida. Herself an alumni of specialized early psychosis services, her work has revolved around early intervention in psychosis and coordinated specialty care for the past decade, with a particular focus on understanding the sociocultural context of the experience of early psychosis, pathways to and through care and engagement with services. Additional areas of focus have included peer support, supported education, and discharge and transition. Her research has been supported by the National Institute of Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and National Institutes of Health. She is currently the International Early Psychosis Association's only elected board member from the United States. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Jones has co-founded and co-led 3 peer-led regional organizations, including Chicago Hearing Voices and the San Francisco Bay Area Hearing Voices Network. In this capacity, she has provided direct individual and group peer support and developed numerous trainings, technical assistance, and support resources for youth and adults, family members and providers focused on peer support, and meaning-centered approaches to working and living with voices and unusual beliefs. Nev, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I'll pass it off to you. Next slide.
Unmute myself. Well, good morning, everyone. It's always a little bit strange to not be able to see people, but I will imagine you all out there. And it's awesome that there is somebody joining all the way from India. So that is definitely the cool side of what COVID has kind of made possible. So a few people may have noticed that I did a little bit of an about face in terms of my focus topic, relatively speaking, at the last minute. But I will be talking about peer support and lived experience kind of integrated throughout my presentation, and hopefully building on some of the really awesome and amazing work that Isa, that Nibel, Nick, and Tamara laid out yesterday. All right, so can go ahead and click to the next slide. As Keisha mentioned, I have kind of worn many different hats in this early psychosis space. I started out as a patient in a specialized early psychosis program, also a research participant, research subject. So the early clinics, many of them were really kind of tied to research programs, and that was my first kind of experience of being a research subject in that kind of setting. And then since then, I've kind of worked on state level policy, national policy, technical assistance development, agency leadership, kind of overseeing early psychosis programs, and then certainly as a researcher. And today's presentation is really going to reflect, I think, where my research has really kind of zeroed in over the past 5 or 6 years. And the 3 kind of major areas are leveraging and centering lived experience, and I will obviously be kind of talking about each of these topics in a lot more depth. Attention to adversity, race, and culture, and that really includes in the context of looking at disengagement from early psychosis services, but also this longer term question of how we sustain the benefits of early intervention for more people over the long term. And I think that if we kind of bring these things together, that in my mind would really bring about transformative change. And next slide. Okay, empirical motivation. So the sort of the setup for this talk, and this is my only kind of slide with references and citations, all of which can be found at the end of the slide deck, which I'm sure will eventually be available to everyone. So the empirical motivation, sometimes I feel like a little bit of a Grinch or a Scrooge or something, for highlighting some of the sort of gaps in kind of coordinated specialty care, as it's been implemented and in terms of what research has helped elucidate to date. Because I think it's important to really recognize how amazing it is, just the sheer numbers of early psychosis programs that have been rolled out in the United States, pretty much all in the last 6 years since the mental health block grant set aside started kicking in 2014. So we now have, I think, well over 350 programs in the US alone. I think more than that in the UK, and at least 100 in Canada. So both in the US and internationally, it has sort of been, in its way, a very kind of transformative service model. In the US context, I think it's also really important to emphasize that kind of historically, over the last 3-4 decades, psychosis has been a really neglected area and topic within social work, counseling, and clinical psychology training programs. And in fact, even nowadays, it's very rare to find actually a graduate training program that really provides kind of extensive mentored or supervised clinical training in therapy for psychosis. So I think, kind of given this landscape where we had these just major gaps in training and people's, just clinicians' ability to kind of meet the needs and engage with folks with psychosis, it's just been tremendous what early intervention and coordinated specialty care have kind of brought about. And then that being said, right, it's not perfect, and there's areas where I think we really need to kind of continue to grow. So one of the more challenging issues has been the loss of the benefits of early intervention programs. And this has mostly been sort of traced anywhere from 3 to 10 years, but where there's 3-year follow-up to 5-year follow-up is where we already start to see the loss of benefits. And what I mean by that is not necessarily that people are deteriorating, quote unquote, after they're discharged from early psychosis programs, but that we see the difference that is initially there between somebody served in an early psychosis program and served in mainstream status quo services disappears over time. And in the studies that have kind of looked at this in a more detailed way across multiple domains, in some cases, both groups are deteriorating, and the group of young people who had previously received early intervention or coordinated specialty care, at some point kind of they catch up with the control group in terms of that deterioration, that downward slope, if you want to visualize it that way. In some cases, they're both improving, but we see kind of improvement equaling out, leveling out over time. And in some cases, it's just that there's not a lot of change. So kind of whatever point people have reached by the end of discharge, they kind of stay there. Now, all those analyses have looked at the sort of entire population of young people who were, who were kind of assigned in a research context to early intervention and psychosis programs. And there's been some work looking at kind of predictors and trying to tease out differences across that population, but I just want to kind of fully acknowledge that I don't think that we have a super sophisticated understanding of that. What one sees in this early psychosis space is just huge heterogeneity in terms of what people are experiencing. And the kind of the relative burden of what they're up against, both in terms of kind of psychosis itself, symptoms, and also just structural disadvantage, poverty, healthcare, access to healthcare, the way these things intersect in the United States, especially for young people who end up, maybe kind of being pushed into Social Security, SSI, SSDI, which then kind of has a life of its own in terms of how it starts to impact people's trajectories in a lot of cases. So in saying that there is concern in the field, there's concern in the United States, there's good reason to have concern about what's happening to folks after discharge. I think we also don't have the full picture of that. And most of the research that has been conducted in a more rigorous way, meaning where there was a comparison group, has not been based in the US. We know that overall outcomes and engagement with services are really pretty profoundly shaped by class, race, and social disadvantage. And this is kind of has been a focus of a lot of my work. We know that over the long term, there remain incredibly high rates of unemployment or underemployment among young people, particularly with the schizophrenia diagnosis, which just kind of requires meeting more kind of stringent criteria. So this is not to say that there's some kind of deeper validity to schizophrenia. I think we need to kind of start deconstructing some of these diagnoses that we maybe over rely on. But it is to say that people kind of falling into that category, we're not seeing the long-term outcomes we want to see. We don't see them even when young people are, getting access to specialized early psychosis services. In models, including kind of social and structural disadvantage, that I've done a lot of this using California data, level of symptoms had only a tiny impact on both engagement and outcomes. They were sort of, far kind of outstripped by trauma, structural disadvantage, poverty, access to healthcare. And that was with data where I could really dig deep in terms of looking at not just the kind of the typical candidates in terms of trauma, like sexual abuse, neglect, physical abuse, but looking at incarceration of a family member, looking at growing up in a high poverty neighborhood, looking at living in overcrowded housing, sort of another indicator of level of poverty, and coming from a family without a history of attending college, or in some cases graduating from high school, undocumented status. And then we see kind of persistent disparities and inequalities very specifically affecting African American clients and families. This is the racial group kind of most impacted by psychosis, and there is a huge amount of debate and discussion about why that is. Certainly a lot of powerful work coming out of the UK, really attributing almost all of these differences to structural disadvantage. There's also overdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, concerns about the role that sort of the kind of surveillance and policing of the African American community in the United States may have. And we see this playing out in coordinated specialty care, both among clients and family members in terms of outcomes and engagement with the program and engagement with kind of the full array of services that coordinated specialty care offers. When we turn to the peer workforce, so this is sort of more the setup for my kind of comments and concerns about peer support and the peer workforce. I think the big issue nationally, and this is not specific to coordinated specialty care, is a lack of career mobility and career options. It's very, very common to see very low wages within the peer workforce, often with no benefits. Sometimes, yes, that's because folks are on SSI, SSDI, but certainly not always. So in some of the national research I've done with really huge samples of peer specialists across the US, we see a lot of people who want to be working full-time and want benefits and are not able to access those. So again, kind of bigger picture than coordinated specialty care, but the same kind of underlying dynamics are kind of present in the CSC space, that there's not really something for young people who are working as peer specialists to advance to, unless they go to college and get retrained. I mean, obviously they can become social workers, counselors, or pursue, other interests altogether. But in terms of really kind of moving up a career ladder within a peer support or lived experience space, those structures are not in place. And then disengagement. So if we look within the first year, so starting coordinated specialty care to the kind of the 12-month follow-up point, we see approximately 40 to 50% of CSC clients disengaging or discharging or being discharged, ostensibly prematurely from the program. We had a paper on this from the On Track New York network come out really recently, with a rate of 43%. And then after 1 year, it becomes a bit harder to interpret some of these numbers, but it's a continued drop off. It's not always clear whether it's sort of the bad thing from kind of a quality improvement perspective, because, some people are like doing fine, don't want the intensity of CSC. So there's a lot of reasons why people can end up leaving those programs, but at the same time, I think in my mind, I'm always thinking about that, especially within the first year. Nearly half of the population is leaving these programs. What is happening to them? What do those outcomes look like? How are they being supported or not? So again, this is just to kind of bring the conversation back around to coordinated specialty care has accomplished really, really important things, monumental in some ways, especially when we kind of just think about how underfunded mental health services are in general in the US. So want to be really emphatic about that. And at the same time, when we really take a hard look at the data, there's definitely still a ways to go. There's definitely still, kind of unaddressed challenges and issues here. So the frame for this presentation is kind of transformative change, or a transformational change framework. I think it's especially kind of appropriate for kind of keynotes or plenaries, as the case might be, to kind of really think beyond the sort of places where we tend to get stuck. And if we start to think about the sort of the minutia, and I don't mean that in a dismissive sense, but of funding, so much always comes back to funding, and to funding structures that we have available or that are not available, that are inaccessible. Whether any given state for early psychosis services is completely relying on the block grant set aside, which is not a sufficient amount of money in any case, or whether they have a huge extra pool of money to draw on that their state has provided through general funds or another mechanism. And, I don't in any way mean to say, oh, we can just brush over all that. But I think sometimes really, really thinking about that big picture of where we would like to go in a more kind of ambitious way. Like if we could really transform things, if we could really do things differently, what would it look like? Okay, next slide. So that's kind of what I'm going to do in this presentation. I'm not really focusing on data. Everything I'm going to say is informed by the research I do, the technical assistance, consulting, and support work I do. So it's all very kind of empirically informed, I would say, but I'm really kind of focusing on the ideas and where we could go, where we could see the field go. So if we think about this in terms of questions, what are these questions that are kind of confronting us, that are pushing us? One, how can we adequately attend to these complex intersections between psychosis, early psychosis services, and race, poverty, welfare benefits, the welfare system in the US, arrest, incarceration, disparities in incarceration, and disability and recovery? How can we give young people what they want and need in a way that brings about sustained change? So during coordinated specialty care, but also after, in the transition out of services and in, sort of the rest of their life that they have to live. And what would our systems, programs, and policies look like if they were truly co-produced and co-led by those who experience psychosis in their families? And historically, this kind of has not been the case, right? So coordinated specialty care and early intervention in psychosis, which is really the international term, these programs were not originally kind of co-produced with young people. And ESA, for all of you who were on the keynote yesterday, is a good example of kind of trying to move into that, in that direction. But the models didn't start there. Okay, and then asking these questions at both the micro and macro level. So when we talk about service and, kind of services, service reforms, I think very often where the conversation at is how we can improve programs or models or approaches, how we can do data collection better, whether it's at a local level, state level, nationally, but it's very much kind of focused on the programs and ways that we can improve them rather than really kind of big picture structural issues. And I think kind of particularly in light of everything going on politically, the Black Lives Matter movement, I wanted to sort of integrate one of the more radical quotes from the late Martin Luther King, which I will read to you guys. Some of you are probably familiar with this. We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see an edifice which produces beggars, needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So April 1967, again, towards the end of Martin Luther King's life, and he sort of pivoted to some extent from kind of really focusing on racism to thinking about how racism is really kind of tied to other oppressive systems, including just the sort of basic operations of the economy and the exploitation of workers. So, oh, sorry, we can stay on that slide. So just staying with Martin Luther King's sentiments for a minute, I think the important thing to emphasize here is poverty and wealth, because, in my mind, and I think if we take a hard look at the data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, people's access to resources, access to healthcare because of the resources and wealth they have, or the lack of access, just play a monumentally huge role in shaping outcomes in this country across the board. People with early psychosis, no exception, but maybe in kind of intersectionally ways, disproportionately impacted by social policies that in some sense are tied to inequalities in terms of wealth. And so, you know, I think the other point that I would make here is just, I'm well aware that none of us as individuals have the ability to change these massive systems in which we're all embedded. But it is important, critically important, I would say, to keep pushing for change, to keep at a minimum acknowledging and validating the extent to which these kinds of systems are impacting on people's lives, whether it's racism or kind of poverty and wealth inequality. So this can play out in interactions with individual clients, right? Around really kind of validating the racism that people may be experiencing, the reasons why they may feel angry and resentful and frustrated about systems, about authority figures, about services, about welfare, et cetera, lack of access to housing. So really kind of equally, I think, kind of attending to those experiences as to psychosis in the kind of sense of, oh, this person is struggling because of their symptoms, when so often those struggles are really more tied to some of these other you know, kind of social systems than they are to psychosis itself. And then at a policy level, for folks out there who are, you know, who are involved in policy, influencing state legislators, working for state mental health authorities, right? Constantly kind of, you know, bringing things back around to structural issues at the same time as trying to work on and work through issues at the sort of the program and implementation level. Okay, next slide. So asking questions in ways that address epistemic justice is my next point. So epistemic justice, and I'll read this quote from Jose Medina in a minute, but epistemic justice really refers to this idea that, that we ideally need to treat people equally as knowers and producers of knowledge, and epistemic injustice arises where that's not the case. So specific to early psychosis or sort of serious mental illness in general, it's, you know, very typical. In fact, most research depends, right, on using service users, service recipients, patients, and families, including those from diverse racial, ethnic, and communities and kind of across the class spectrum as sources of input and information. They're the data points in research studies, right? They're the clients that we serve if we're doing kind of QI or performance monitoring at a program level. Where does that, you know, where do those data points, where do those metrics come from, right? They come from clients. But we're not necessarily treating them as individuals with the power and the epistemic authority to directly shape services, right? To actually call the shots about what services look like, what the priorities should be, to set the agenda, and to provide cross-cutting expertise. So, you know, I think that if we kind of look at the landscape of early psychosis kind of training and technical assistance nationally, pretty much the only place that we see people with lived experience playing a big role is when it comes to kind of training and TA around peer support, and nowhere else. That doesn't really make sense, right? There's a really kind of fundamental way in which service recipients, no matter what area we might be talking about, you know, need to be kind of much more centrally involved and in a public and visible way, right, as the experts. And not just experts over their own experience, experts over psychosis, experts over what services should ideally look like. So Jose Medina is a philosopher still very much alive at Northwestern University in Chicago. He's considered an international expert on kind of this issue of epistemic injustice. So this is a quote. People's participation is allowed and their contributions are in fact used for knowledge production and knowledge transmission purposes, but nonetheless, they are not treated as subjects of knowledge or epistemic agents, only as sources of information, that is, as objects. Okay, so next slide. So now I'm gonna kind of dive into the three areas, starting with lived experience. And the case I really want to make here is that if we want to engage young people, if we want to improve services, if we want to improve outcomes, especially over the long term, in my mind, it really begins with a very deep understanding of service users' experiences, priorities, and needs. And then engaging with these experiences in a really sustained way, meaning you don't learn once, right? It's an ongoing project of kind of collaborative learning. And the integration of staff and leaders with lived experience. So in an ideal world, what we would see is, you know, policy experts in the early psychosis space who have personal experience, folks who have family experience, the same thing among kind of, you know, national trainers on different models. We would see, you know, kind of ample representation within TA products. We would see representation both on the peer support side in terms of direct program staff, but also medication management and clinical services. In other words, we would see this integration and infusion of this space with lived experience rather than kind of siloing that in sort of relatively narrow ways. Okay, next slide. And this is just kind of a visual depiction of that, right? So what we most often see nowadays, right, is we might have a client advisory board tied to kind of what I would call the kind of decision-making authority structure. So you have state entities providing oversight. Sometimes you have an intermediary that's like a managed care organization or a managing entity of some kind. You have agency leadership, you have program leadership at the sort of more micro level of a CSC team, right? It's the team members led by their team lead or manager. And typically where a client advisory board is providing unidirectional input, but those, you know, peers, young people are very rarely actually part of this direct decision-making hierarchy. And then within the level of the team, we tend to see peer support at the bottom. Sometimes supported education and employment positions are compensated equally to peer support. So those could be side by side. They're kind of at the bottom of this hierarchy in terms of status and compensation. Also expectations around education. So I'm not saying this is a simple issue, but nevertheless, I would sort of think that probably a lot of us would recognize, right, that placing kind of lived experience in this box low down on the hierarchy is ultimately not a good thing. Ultimately, we cannot stop there. And that is never really what the peer movement was about in calling for nothing about us without us, right? It was really about influence over services and rethinking services, rethinking how to support people, not just kind of one narrow category of support. Okay, next slide. All right, so just a little bit more then about what this, you know, could or would look like in my mind. Really engaging with user experience. So this is service recipients, service users, those who are actually kind of experiencing the early psychosis services that we provide. Deep engagement with what their experience actually is, whether this is at a program level through quality improvement, whether it's through evaluation, locally, regionally, research, or consultation activities. And what I'm really thinking of here is focus groups, interviews, more creative kind of digital feedback approaches. But we're really kind of constantly engaged with what it is that young people are actually experiencing. I would say a lot of the time, as somebody who does a lot of qualitative research, I hear and kind of come up again and again and again at these, these disconnects between what clients or service users are experiencing, between what's important to them and kind of where communication is at with their program. I'll say a bit more about this, with respect to medications. I can't tell you how many young people in coordinated specialty care I have interviewed over the years who say, of course I'm not actually taking my meds. Do you tell that to your psychiatrist? No, because I don't feel like I can, because they want me to be taking the meds. My family does. I don't feel like I can be honest or open. We see it in the context of discharge, as I'll talk about. And that's just one example. I think other examples are, kind of perceived lack of ability to really kind of explore the meaning of psychosis in a non-pathologizing way. So if somebody is experiencing, voices or, kind of unusual perceptions, thoughts, beliefs that map onto a spiritual framework, really being able to kind of to go there, to express that. I think, again, Nick and Nibel in the keynote yesterday, kind of brought out and mentioned some of this as well. So that's often a source of disconnect, even among young people who would say, yeah, I love my clinician, I love my therapist. Well, would you tell them these things? No, because they don't get it. They don't understand. Our conversations just don't go there. This maybe becomes particularly problematic in contexts in which there's a more non-mainstream kind of cultural framework and context that's coming into play, whether it's religious, spiritual, or non-Western in some way. User insights. So there's the experience, there's really understanding, okay, like how are you engaging with the program? Or if you've disengaged, why have you disengaged? Why didn't you like this program? Why did you leave it? But there's also user insights in terms of what would work. And this is kind of a returning of epistemic agency to people, because it puts them in the position of making the recommendations, not just sort of the raw input in terms of I've experienced this problem, but here's what I think the solutions are. And it's not a matter of one person saying that and we all follow that one person. What I'm talking about is really kind of large scale engagement with what folks are experiencing and their suggestions for change, and thinking about that in a very systematic and rigorous way. Thinking about differences in culture, race, ethnicity, level of resources, disadvantage, right, that are going to be affecting and impacting on what we hear from people and what their priorities might be. And then I think also moving and pivoting from this sort of knowledge generated within the system to knowledge and innovative generated outside of the system. So former service recipients, the sort of the peer movement, activists, the hearing voices movement, right? There's a lot of work in the kind of the bigger world of mental health, hearing voices, kind of psychosis, advocacy, and activism that is, kind of very generative in the sense of, all kinds of ideas about how we could approach and, work with people's distressing experiences and meeting them where they're at. So I think the field really kind of turning also to that, so to speak, external expertise and looking at what's happening in that space and not seeing that as a confrontation, right? Not a kind of clinical, anti-clinical, or anti-psychiatry kind of loggerhead, but how do we really kind of collaborate? How do we really kind of honor the sort of experiential wisdom that has developed in different places, not just the United States, and how can we kind of leverage that to rethink how we're providing services and what clinical interactions look like? And then user leadership, I kind of mentioned, right? But leadership roles, clinical, policy, technical assistance, kind of running the gamut. And I think, kind of part of the rationale here is that all of us who have been in or are in leadership roles know how many decisions that we're making on a daily basis. And the best kind of advisory consultation mechanisms in the world are not going to make up for the fact that because of efficiency and because of how the systems that we work within are structured, in some cases just because of legal liability, right? As a researcher, sometimes you're in charge and have to be in charge and are legally in charge for legal reasons, because you also have the liability for the project. If something goes wrong with the project, the buck kind of stops with you. And so it's responsibility, but it's also power. Leadership roles, really do shape things. And if we don't see kind of service users and folks with psychosis represented at that level, it's going to be problematic, no matter how good of a job that we're doing to be inclusive in other ways. At the same time, so it's not an either or, it's not saying participatory approaches and co-production aren't important. It's just saying we really do have to think about leadership, integrated leadership. Co-production, kind of a British term that some of you all may not have heard or not be as familiar with, where there is, the idea is that there's true co-leadership over whether it's service redesign or research or policy development, and that at least ideally, decision-making is really shared between the two parties, so to speak. So professionals or policymakers or researchers and stakeholders, namely service users and family members who are joining together with them in those processes. Importantly, co-production, again, always kind of extends to kind of the higher levels of decision making. So it's not just about kind of low level kind of incremental quality improvement, but it's really what's the vision for this program, what's the vision for this service, and how can we co-produce that? And then from there, what are next steps? What are concrete ways of actualizing that? Okay, next slide. All right, so those are my big points about lived experience, and I would say in sort of more of a, I guess, a hopeful vein that if we turn to the UK, we see more of this happening. So there was just a huge national commission convened, and they're finishing up all their reporting now to look at early psychosis services across the country, fully co-produced. There was an entire arm of that project that was former service user led and entirely focused on kind of understanding young people's experiences of early psychosis services in the UK. And then joining together, obviously, with other approaches, methods. You see lived experience professional positions growing in the UK, including at higher levels, and distinct from peer support, even where there are peer support ladders. The idea is that, peer support positions are just that, right? Ideally providing either individual or group peer support, whereas the sort of lived experience professional roles are doing other things. Policy, outreach, kind of community education, community building, all the other things where, kind of lived experience can really inform and infuse services. And I think it's helped in the UK that there's really stronger centralization, smaller country, and really more top-down mandates that we can't proceed. It's a right of service recipients and service user communities to play a major role in shaping the services that they receive. And I think that's just kind of more universally accepted. And then because things are so centralized, it's easier to ensure that that happens across programs and regions, whereas in the US, we have thousands of nonprofits and intermediary agencies, and all the states are different, and SAMHSA in some ways has relatively little control even. All right, so next slide. So I kind of am gonna kind of integrate comments about race, culture, class, poverty with kind of this theme of sustaining change. So this slide, I didn't create this lovely graphic. This comes from kind of the self-determination theory body of work. And if you guys are not familiar with that, self-determination theory kind of really focuses on understanding what it is that brings about sustained behavioral change in people. A lot of that work not necessarily looking at kind of psychiatric or mental health issues, but the decision to start exercising, career decisions, kind of grades and educational engagement. So kind of many different areas. And within self-determination theory, there is this sort of basic tenet that we have three basic psychological needs. So if we think about sort of Maslow's hierarchy, this is of course assuming that more fundamental needs around, kind of housing, food, etc. are met. So the three basic psychological needs are competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So I'll say more about these on the next slide. So autonomy. So this is the idea that when we're doing things, we're doing them because they align, they are self-aligned, they align with how we see ourselves, what we want to be doing, where we want to be going. They're not coerced in either the hard or the soft sense. And I think one thing that's pretty powerful about self-determination theory is the level of attention to kind of soft pressure or coercion. That's you're going to medical school because your parents want you to be a doctor, not because you want to. You're taking medications because your parents or your clinicians want you to. And it's not that they're forcing you, but you're very aware that that's what they want, and that becomes this internalized social pressure. So, kind of once we really move to autonomous motivation, there's really a much deeper appreciation and self-motivated sense that I'm doing this because I want to. That does sound a little bit, kind of Western individualistic. And so I do want to say that I think that we can, kind of be a little bit more expansive about how we understand autonomy. That might be the autonomy of the family unit. It might be a more cultural sense of autonomy, but I still think that there's really kind of important things here, especially when it comes to kind of thinking about early psychosis service engagement. Competence. Belief in one's abilities. So this is a little bit simpler, like the belief that you can do something, but also kind of that there is the capacitating conditions that allow you to do that, and you're aware of them. So an example of that would be if somebody has a criminal background, it's, I would roll this up into competence because the environmental condition, they might have a job, they might know that they themselves as an individual could do that. They could be an awesome, I don't know, in states where certain kinds of felony convictions might prevent you from being a lawyer, for example. They can do that. They have the intelligence, the drive, the passion maybe to do social justice work, but that criminal justice record or arrest record potentially blocks them from doing that. So kind of thinking about that together. Relatedness. So this is sort of sense of belonging, belief that one belongs and is, and is included in a social group, in cultural groups, in kind of society writ large, a positive social identity. And then doing these things, whatever they are, whatever X, whatever our little black box is, that doing that has social meaning and value, and also that the individual has social meaning and value. So this is sort of basic, with my somewhat liberal interpretation, but basic self-determination theory. And then it's a question of, okay, how does this play out when we're looking at psychosis, early psychosis? And thinking about programs, to what extent are they supporting autonomy, competence, and relatedness in ways that will carry over into the future and lay a strong enough foundation for the future, such that even if kind of post-coordinated specialty care or post-early intervention, young people don't have that level of programmatic support and the values orientation of CSC, that they can kind of keep going and keep succeeding on their own, or as a family unit, if we want to think of that more kind of collectivistically, or their family of choice, not necessarily right, birth or natural family. Okay, next slide. So I just want to say kind of a little bit more. This is drawing on some of my qualitative work, which is really mapping out the trajectories of young people following discharge from coordinated specialty care services in the US. So autonomy support, and here kind of the example of medication. So I'm paraphrasing somewhat. These are a mix between quotes and kind of paraphrasing. I really liked my psychiatrist and therapist, so I took meds while I was in the program, but yeah, I was waiting until I left so I could go off them. It was really never on the table to discontinue, and so I did so as soon as I left. I heard this again and again and again, and what it made me think of instantly was kind of self-determination and that importance of one's own motivations, that as long as one is really kind of doing something for other people, that's not sustainable. And I think that if we think about CSC, what this could look like, and again, there's variation in programs. We don't have one model, and then, the staff on any given team can just be so different, right? As somebody who's kind of worked with many, many different teams in different states. So in some cases, a prescriber might say, anytime you want to discontinue, just let me know. Cautious optimism, let's try it out, let's see how it goes, it's up to you. And sometimes people discontinue meds, and that is awesome. They really, thrive without medication. Just empirically, we know that this is true. Some people are going to discover that really the psychosis just kind of creeps back in an overwhelmingly distressing way. But that experience is necessary for them to come to the conclusion themselves that the benefits outweigh the risks, or that they want to, kind of remain on, let's say, antipsychotics in a sustained way. So that's really different to going through 2 years and you're taking the meds because your parents and your psychiatrist want you to. And at some point when that scaffolding is gone, you're really just going to stop because you were never really doing it for yourself. So I think this is one area where we could really kind of be thinking about what are the mechanisms, what are the ways that we could really kind of strengthen autonomy support in programs, and medications only being kind of one area. Okay, and then kind of competence with respect to work. So this is a complex one because I think families and really beyond families, peers in the sense of other students, co-workers, and then certainly supervisors, teachers, etc., are really kind of impacting on a young person's experience. But, just as an example, this is a parent of a former CSC recipient. The program was amazing. They did sort of try to help with the job, but honestly, we see no way. He's just not capable of working. really, really challenging space. It's really, really challenging because the power of kind of internalized, lowered self-expectations, whether they're for yourself or for a family member, you know, really, I think can't be overstated. And you know, it's very easy, I think, drawing on personal experience as well, right, to kind of slip and slide into this place where you just feel so kind of hopeless and keep replaying in your mind these kind of thoughts and beliefs that you're not adequate, that you can't do things, that you can't work, that just starts to become your reality. Other people see it as the reality when it's not. And I think it's very, very tricky to navigate this in a way that doesn't dismiss or downplay the challenges people have, which can be really, really serious, right? Really, really serious in terms of just impairment, to use that sort of disability language, and how, you know, kind of one's ability to work, go to school, participate in the community can be. And at the same time, we know that a lot of people who do ultimately go on to be very, very successful can start out in this place. So I'm not saying in any way that CSC teams don't try to work on these issues, just that they're very challenging, they're very tricky, and I think there's a lot more that we could learn, again, from really kind of trying to engage with families and young people, where in spite of CSC, there is this sort of this belief, this narrative around limitations and inability to work, really zeroing in on, you know, SSI, SSDI enrollment in CSC programs, and what's really behind that, what's driving it, why are people making those decisions. A lot of the time, you know, we really don't have a very good understanding of that. There's no qualitative research, period, published on why young people in CSC programs enroll in SSI, SSDI. So, you know, sort of my point here is there's a lot about what people's experiences actually are, what's going into the decisions that they make, that we don't understand and haven't sufficiently engaged with, and really would need to kind of achieve this sense of competence, leaving coordinated specialty care. And of course, we see these internalized, like, lowered self-expectations, leaving programs. I'm not really sure about myself anymore. I was working a part-time job when I left, but then I lost it after I ended up back in the hospital, and sort of people not knowing how to pick up the pieces. Okay, next slide. And then finally, relatedness and belonging. And here's sort of, you know, a point I think that would tie into the original presentation that I had in mind, which was a version of an ISPS talk that Sasha DeBrule and I gave, which is really about providing young people with choices and actually just encouraging them to come to their own explanations of what it is they're experiencing, creating opportunities for really exploring meaning, rather than in a more reductionistic way, kind of treating the experience of psychosis as just distressing symptoms that need to be managed or need to be suppressed with medications. Which is going to work for some people, or be the narrative and the framework that some people are attracted to, but not for many others. And I think especially when we look at young people who are disengaging from early psychosis services, that's so often a part of it. It's a rejection of the framework. It's a rejection of the way that what they're experiencing has been sort of mirrored back to them by the program. So I won't read through each of these quotes, but just to kind of reiterate that a lot of what I see talking to discharged CSC clients is that they've never really worked through pretty fundamental issues of their identity, their place in the world, what these experiences mean, what they say about them, And again, given that there are often very few opportunities to do that after discharge, right? In many cities in the US, you pretty much can't find an accessible therapist who has been trained to work with psychosis and who would sit down with a young person and, you know, be totally game for, you know, kind of diving into, you know, seemingly strange religious experiences of somebody with a schizophrenia diagnosis. And, I think what we see is the opposite, that causes a lot of discomfort in most clinicians. And so they just don't go there. So if it doesn't happen during CSC, kind of when is it going to happen? And yet young adulthood is this critical period of identity development. And so much of the work of being a young and emerging adult is kind of figuring out these things, you know, kind of one's place in the world and one's identity. And these are major experiences, right? Psychosis is a major experience for most people, even when, you know, for somebody who is very kind of quote unquote responsive to medications and all their symptoms just disappear. It's a major experience. The interactions with systems that it can bring about, arrest, incarceration, other kinds of criminal justice system entanglements, involuntary hospitalization, these can be huge. And we know from research that like Kim Muser and others have conducted that rates of PTSD or young people who would meet criteria for PTSD just based on their initial treatment experiences in the context of first episode approach half of the population, at least again from kind of Kim's studies. So all of these things, this is majorly impacting on a young person's identity. And I think there needs to be kind of so much emphasis on facilitating the processing of those experiences in a way that's not reductionistic. Ideally, that would, of course, continue afterwards. There's a kind of a family role to be played here, you know, kind of, I think, capacitating and enabling family members to also interact more along those lines with young people or relatives or family who are experiencing psychosis or have. Okay. And then just to bring this back around to structural barriers. So sort of my point, a lot of what I was just saying is like, how could programs, again, engage with these experiences more deeply that young people are having, really kind of think through in a very kind of deep, nuanced way, what are the implications here? And what would it be like to kind of rejigger services in a way that are much more kind of sensitive to these issues, but also circling back around to structural barriers. Right? So, you know, kind of bracketing the individual level stuff at the interpersonal level, you know, stigma and prejudice and discrimination. And I'm kind of one of these people who is fairly skeptical of kind of big national anti-stigma campaigns, especially with kind of, you know, celebrities flashed across the TV screen. I don't really think that that's doing very much to address the day-to-day discrimination that especially folks with psychosis or schizophrenia diagnoses experience. So there's just a kind of a reality at which kind of a certain reductionistic, pathologizing, often fear-driven way of thinking about psychosis is really going to be true for a lot of people just in terms of their everyday social interactions. You know, kind of, you know, even for somebody like me, I would say how it plays out if you're a researcher, policy person in this space with personal experience of psychosis, schizophrenia, you're just going to hear cognitive deficits almost constantly, lack of insight almost constantly. And, you know, I think just thinking about the kind of the cumulative impact of like your group, this group that you belong to, this identity category you belong to, so constantly being talked about in a negative way as a problem, right? As a burden on the system, as a burden on family, and as kind of riddled with deficits. So that's something that we can, you know, kind of work on changing. Lowered expectations, I kind of already talked about. family relationships and support. And then really zooming out to the structural and institutional level, welfare policy. I'm sure you all have heard this 1,000 times, right? The biggest predictor of not working is enrolling in SSI, SSDI. Now, I mean, part of that is because of what drives enrollment, but we know that even kind of controlling for people's level of impairments, quote unquote, or symptoms, a lot of folks who end up on SSI, SSDI could be working, could be going back to school with sufficient supports and don't have them, could be going back to work or school if SSI, as it continues to be in many states, were not so directly tied to Medicaid, and therefore going back to work, especially if it's part-time, means that they will risk losing access to healthcare. So it's a lot more complicated than this person is just kind of permanently disabled and has to be on SSI, SSDI. Accommodations in work and school, are often really, really inadequate. The Bazelon Center has now, just because they have been overwhelmed, as I understand it, by kind of communications contacts, pleas for help from students who are getting placed on mandated leaves and denied accommodations. So they have a whole kind of new service to try to provide a higher level of support to students in particular. We see this happening in work settings. It's really problematic, and it really has to be addressed ultimately within those school and work settings, because a supported education and employment worker cannot make those changes, especially as an individual. There needs to be a much more, kind of systemic effort to do that. Criminal justice history checks. This is heartbreaking. I'm sure that you all have run into this, right? The young person who really, because of their psychosis, has ended up with an arrest record, with a felony maybe. It's not expungible for one reason or another, or wasn't, there wasn't a diversion option available to them. So that's now part of their permanent record, and it haunts them really on every level, right? Their own fear of going into a job, a job interview, and having, being asked the question on a job application. When it comes up, when there's a background check, how do they explain it? This is just awful and really, really disproportionately impacts people with, SMI or psychosis, who so often their entanglement with the criminal justice system is never would have come about independent of their experiences. So those are just some examples. If we don't address those things, we're also not going to see the sustained change that we want to see. And, I think almost needless to say, we see huge intersectionality of race and class here, right? When it comes to poverty, when it comes to welfare, when it comes to entanglements with the criminal justice system and incarceration. I mean, really, really disproportionately impacting certain communities of color, African Americans, the Latinx community, right? This is just something that we really, really have to grapple with, because we're not going to see equity until we start to kind of address these issues. Okay. I'm just doing a time check. All right. I think I'm almost done with my slides. Quick point about time scales to think about too, right, is that CSC is spanning this kind of, for most people, for the sort of the average CSC client, they're going to be between the ages of 18 and 24, give or take, while enrolled in CSC. That's typically, in kind of career development terms, a point at which you're just even thinking, do I want to go to school? Do I want to work? Would I just start with an entry-level job? Do I want to go to grad school or aspire to go to grad school or work towards that? What the heck major do I even want? Right? So it's this very early period of career development, and yet then you're leaving CSC and you're going out into kind of an employment and higher ed arena in which kind of discrimination and prejudice are rampant, the added burden for folks who have a criminal justice record, et cetera. So just sort of thinking about this kind of just disconnect or gap between career development over the long term and what that really means to kind of arrive at a more crystallized or consolidated career and a living wage versus where young people are during this early period that they're typically enrolled in CSC. And then next slide. Okay, and this is the last slide. So just bringing us back around. I know, and in fact, because I, also feel this way, right? That some of this presentation is just, oh, what the heck can any of us do about, kind of structural inequality and the income gap and the shrinking middle class, what can we do about that? So I totally get that, but I just want to, before closing, just really emphasize the importance of these kind of big picture, ambitious visions of what things could look like so that we don't get kind of too trapped and too narrow in the way that we're thinking about what we're doing, the work we're doing, and what would be possible. Okay, I am done, and now Q&A, but thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nev, and we really appreciate you sharing your insight and expertise. We do have some questions in the Q&A pod, so to lead us through that section, I'm going to hand it over to Christina Marshall, LCSW and Power Program Behavioral Health Supervisor from the Center for Healthcare Services.
Hi, Dr. Jones, your presentation was really phenomenal, and I'm sure when you have a chance to read back through the chat, you'll see just how inspirational a lot of what you shared was for the individuals who participated. So we do have some questions here. First, one of the first questions made reference to the downward slope that you spoke about when you were mentioning how the benefits of early intervention programs are lost by 3 to 5 years. And so Susan M. asked a question, how do we keep this downward slope from happening?
Right, and that was probably at the beginning of my presentation. I don't in any way pretend to have the answers. Or if there is an answer, to me, it is really engaging with, with young people and their families in the years following discharge. And I have begun to do that, and in no way have the kind of the funding or capacity to do that on the scale that we need to be doing that nationally, and across the kind of diversity of clients and intersectional experiences. And I think we need to start there. We need to really understand in this country, in different parts of the US, what is happening to people and learn from that. Where are they running into the barriers, and then thinking, kind of how do we troubleshoot those, or even almost a sequential intercept mapping kind of approach for those who are familiar, right? Like, what are the different points and domains following discharge where people are getting kind of blocked and stuck, and then how can we systematically try to address those, whether it's through policy or intervention.
And then a similar question that we received from Chris L. is, I would like to think that the challenges of the illness do not become less as a person ages and hits new developmental milestones and challenges. So in the study about benefit loss after 3 to 5 years, how is loss of support conceptualized as a factor of the loss of benefits?
So it's a really great question. And again, the frustrating thing, but this has like frustrated me for a decade, at least, is the fact that we do so little research on what people are experiencing after discharge. So the studies that we have are kind of pretty blunt in the sense of not really answering these questions with any nuance. There have been a couple of so-called extension trials in East Asia, in Northern Europe, and in Canada that have looked at the impact of extending the sort of the CSC or early intervention model up to 5 years, and they've come to inconclusive. they've been sort of very inconclusive. Some of them, you know, suggesting that that helps. In Northern Europe, not. It's so hard to compare across systems. So one of the explanations of the Danish trial not finding any real difference is that the Danish healthcare system is already providing such robust supports that that's why we wouldn't see so much of an additive impact. So I think, you know, I hate to sort of a cop out, but I really think we need more, you know, we really need more research to understand what's happening in the US. And we have such a different healthcare system. And yeah, so lots of question marks there. I mean, good reasons for us to be worried and really motivated to do this work. What I see is all kinds of things just in the qualitative work I've done with former clients. It can be medications. It can be, you know, complete lack of support from providers because they get kicked out of their next program because you only have 3 no-shows and then you're just automatically discharged, and then they don't have the resources or knowledge to get relinked up, or they end up in very, you know, non-recovery oriented programs. But it's also people who are overall kind of doing fine, but the criminal justice background thing. And so, and they're just getting more and more depressed and demoralized because they feel like their whole envisioned future is just not there because of this arrest record, not really because of the psychosis, but it was linked to the psychosis. So, you know, I think that if we could look at much larger samples, probably some of these things would become patterns. And then again, it would be a matter of, okay, how can we address that? How can we address that? The service issues, the employment and education issues, the discrimination, the community participation.
Really thoughtful answer. Thank you for that. The next question we have here is from David McClung. He asks, what are some of the pathways that you see available for peers to champion attention to equity and intersectionality?
Right. So again, this is a great question. We just had a paper, so a group of folks I work with in Southern California, Vicky Ojeda and Todd Gilmer. Vicky has an R01 from NIMHD focused on young adult peer support and racial ethnic disparities. So we had a paper come out a couple of days ago showing that ethnic match for Latinx clients appears to narrow disparities, and that overall peer support of any kind, regardless of ethnic match, seems to be helping reduce disparities. And this is for young people with SMI. And for some of you who are familiar with like the FSP model in California, full service partnership, so very similar to a CSC population in a lot of ways. So that might be part of the answer here. And you know, obviously kind of anti-racist work can be undertaken and championed by anyone in an early psychosis setting. But I think the powerful thing about the peer support role is the ability to bring that together with lived experience of psychosis ideally, and you know, kind of help other team members maybe adopt a different perspective about ways in which culture and psychosis are intersecting. If people are not, I don't know if we'll be able to add links maybe that would go out at some point, but Oscar Jimenez Solomon at Columbia, the Center for Cultural Excellence, created this just amazing series of videos that feature the stories of actual young people with who are on track clients. Most of them are played by professional actors, so don't think that these young people were being exploited. Their names are not their real names. They're incredibly powerful stories exploring the intersections of psychosis and culture, race, ethnicity. And those are something that peer specialists, certainly everybody else, but it might be a different conversation in a peer support context. So sort of like tools that kind of help open up that conversation with clients not in a really open way, so that anything is on the table in terms of discussion or where conversation would go.
And next we have James. He submitted this question when you were speaking about the self-determination theory, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And he asks, how does this differ from multicultural theories that already exist in psychotherapy?
Well, there's so there's so much cultural work in psychology and therapy, so I wouldn't pretend to say that sort of that I'm have like kind of come up with an intersectional framework. I think structural competency, though, is the sort of the particular thread of work within psychiatry, psychology that I would kind of point to that has really influenced me, and often I'm more kind of explicit about mentioning. So structural competency, if you Google it, there's a great website actually that sort of the founding figures have put together.
Okay, and the rest of the questions are the questions that came in following the presentation. Billy asks, do you have any information about learning how to hear and understand a 20-something having ideas and stress about their spiritual life? Definitely when it comes to some unusual thoughts and how to validate them, but at the same time, help them find a way to find a safe social place to land and be successful.
So if I'm hearing this right, this is maybe a very diplomatic, and I mean that in the best possible sense, way of sort of asking, about this sort of collision that we sometimes see or perceive as being there around people's beliefs, in the context of psychosis or interpretations of their experience and what we see as being like life goals, employment, independent housing, whatever it might be. So if I'm kind of getting that right, what I usually say when I'm doing like kind of clinician trainings on psychosis is human beings are very, very complex. And I think so much can be going on. I think that psychosis sometimes can be a kind of a retreat. Like sometimes when you feel like your whole life is falling apart, yes, maybe you want to go to grad school, you don't believe you can get there. And it is so much easier to sort of retreat into psychosis. It can be really painful to have those conversations about school or work. So I think sometimes that's what's going on, certainly me, guilty as charged, absolutely. I think that, in other cases, there's sort of a testing of people. Sometimes you can just get very frustrated by your experiences constantly being dismissed and almost like, okay, I'm just going to insist on it to sort of prove a point that my clinicians are just not believing me, or maybe it even becomes a more blah sort of like F you because you're not taking what I'm saying seriously. So I think it's very complicated, and I often think that more discussion and more opening things up rather than trying to think like, I don't know, more from a motivational interviewing framework, right? Like how do we like kind of troubleshoot this disconnect, or how do we kind of get a client on board with kind of recognizing that their goal is really X and these beliefs they have are blocking that. Instead, let's just really talk about it and think about other things that might be going on there and create the space where those could maybe be worked through. So that's kind of it's hard to answer as a general rule, but I feel like in a specific individual case, very often, when I'm hearing kind of clinicians talk about this or dealing with it myself, it's really something else that's going on. And the solution really isn't, let's try to get them past that belief as much as it is let's open this up in a different way.
Maria asks, what changes would you recommend for current therapeutic approaches to better integrate our clients' own narratives of their experience? Most of our available materials seem to focus on symptom reduction and, as you mentioned, cognitive impairment and lack of insight. What would be more helpful for clients to focus on in therapy that would empower them, increase their sense of autonomy, and have longer sustained benefits?
Yeah, so I am I'm serious when I say this. I am happy to do a webinar for any program out there, free of charge, because this is something that I train folks on, that I'm happy to send my PowerPoints. I should just maybe like audio tape myself doing one of my workshops and just put it on YouTube so it's free and accessible sometime, because I can't answer this in a few minutes, but this is, you know, kind of a huge part of what my work has been devoted to, and kind of trying to come up with concrete ways to kind of help clinicians have different conversations, engage in different ways. Voices and belief mapping is part of that. So I think I've kind of personally drawn on, you know, a number of different kind of traditions and approaches to kind of generate some, you know, ideas. But I really, anybody who is interested, this is just my personal belief in kind of, you know, kind of social justice, you know, is something that I would really like to help change, and no need to have money to support it.
And speaking of money, Tara asks us if we've seen anyone in the US having luck getting payment for CSC or similar services reimbursed by a commercial insurance company.
Dave Shern is doing a webinar on exactly that topic, and I believe a week or two, it was just, NASHPA just sent out a message on PepNet. I think maybe PepNet is sponsoring it. But anyway, so yeah, maybe folks could get the link up, but for sure, if you're not on PepNet, join PepNet. It was posted there. Dave Shern is like that. He's been doing all this work on exactly that topic. I'm excited about it.
Okay, so we are drawing to an end here in the Q&A, and unfortunately we haven't had enough time to answer all of these really great questions. I know that the coordinators of the committee plan to, or excuse me, of the conference plan to ensure that a lot of these questions can get answered following up.
Christina, can I though just this one of Patrick's, sorry, just like give me 1 minute, because I just want to say to Patrick and all the other peer specialists, former clients, current clients out there, please, I really, really think there needs to be a national community. And if anybody is interested in that nationally and supporting that locally, like, please email me. I would do anything I could to sort of support that. And I you know, a collective effort of those of us who have kind of worked or been through these programs. So sorry, I just wanted to say that while I'm live.
No, thank you for that.